Ready to travel back in time with me to the world of early 19th century opera?
Oh, I'm always up for a good opera adventure.
Well, get ready to dive deep into Samori, an opera that dared to be different.
Different, how so?
You see, unlike other operas of its time that often fell back on stereotypes.
Ah, those stereotypical portrayals of other cultures that were all too common back then.
Exactly, but Samori aimed for something much more ambitious, a nuanced portrayal of Indian culture.
Now, that's intriguing. A nuanced portrayal of India in the early 1800s. That's not something you'd come across every day.
And thankfully, we've got a treasure trove of resources to guide us.
Oh, like what?
Excerpts from the original libretto of Samori itself, giving us a peek into the story and the characters. And we've also got chapters from an academic study that really digs into the context and creative process behind the opera.
Wow, so we're going behind the scenes.
Absolutely. So, ready to jump in?
Let's do this.
All right. So, imagine you're attending an opera in the early 1800s.
A time when operas often drew inspiration from various cultures, for better or worse.
Right. But instead of encountering the typical tropes and cliches, Samori aimed to offer a deeper, more authentic representation of India.
A bold move for its time. So how did they go about achieving that authenticity?
Research, research, research.
Of course, but in the early 1800s, where did they even find reliable information about a culture as distant as India?
That's where Franz Huber, the librettist, the one who writes the words for the opera, comes in. And get this, Huber wasn't just any writer. He was a journalist.
A journalist writing an opera? That's an interesting combination.
Right, and it might explain his meticulous approach to research. He was used to digging for facts and seeking multiple perspectives.
So he approached it like a true journalist on a mission to uncover the real story of India, not just perpetuate existing narratives.
Exactly. And his commitment to authenticity shines through in the three main sources he relied on for Samori. First, he immersed himself in the travelogues of Pierre Sonnerat.
Saurat, the French explorer. Weren't his writings full of vivid descriptions and sketches from his travels?
You bet. Imagine his detailed accounts and visual references, especially his sketches of grand Indian temples, specifically pagodas sparking inspiration for the elaborate stage designs in Samori.
So they wanted to transport the audience visually to India, to set the scene just right.
Exactly, but it went beyond just the visuals. Huber also turned to Georg Forster's translation of the Sanskrit play Sakuntala.
Sakuntala. That play had taken Europe by storm, introducing audiences to Indian literature.
You know it, and it emphasized the importance of understanding a story within its own unique cultural context.
So no more superficial interpretations this time. It's about appreciating the deeper meaning and cultural significance behind the story.
Precisely. But wait, there's more. Huber had one more trick up his sleeve. He dug into the writings of Fra Paolino da San Bartolomeo, a real pioneer who had spent years living and working in India.
Wow, talk about firsthand experience. That's invaluable for a project like this.
Right. Imagine the level of detail in his accounts. Religious ceremonies, social customs, even descriptions of musical instruments.
So we've got travelogues for the visuals, a play for the literary side, and firsthand accounts for everyday life and customs. Huber really wanted to immerse himself in Indian culture, even if it was through the words of others.
He really did, and this dedication to detail really shines through, particularly in that elaborate wedding ceremony in Act 1 of Samori.
A wedding. Now that's something we can all relate to, even centuries later.
It's true. So imagine this. The bride is being ritually cleansed with water carried by 7 married women, symbolizing purity and blessings.
7 married women, that's quite specific.
It is. And then there's a burning lamp with 7 wicks, a beacon of protection and good fortune illuminating the scene.
Okay, I'm starting to sense a theme with the number 7 here.
You're picking up on the details. And then the Homen ceremony, a sacred fire ritual filling the air with the aroma of specific incense and sandalwood. He even included details like 7 earthen jars filled with rice plants, symbolizing prosperity and abundance.
Wow, talk about attention to detail.
Yeah.
It sounds like Huber went above and beyond to recreate an authentic Indian wedding experience for the Viennese audience.
He really did. But it makes you wonder, could even the most meticulous research truly capture the essence of such a culturally rich event?
Right. How much of Huber's own European perspective inevitably shaped his portrayal, even with all that research?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one we'll keep exploring as we delve deeper into Samori. It's one thing to describe a culture through stage directions and costumes, but music adds another layer, doesn't it? It can really capture the essence of a place.
Absolutely. And that's the challenge Vogler, our composer, embraced. He even went as far as incorporating an actual Indian melody into one of the arias.
Wait, hold on. An actual melody. How did he even get his hands on something like that back then? Did they have recordings or sheet music from India in the early 1800s?
Not quite recordings or sheet music as we know them today. Remember, this is the early 1800s. But Vogler relied on transcriptions of Indian melodies documented by, you guessed it, sources like Fra Paolino de San Bartolomeo's writings.
Ah, so those first-hand accounts come in handy again. They really were a goldmine of information for both Vogler and Huber. But even with those transcriptions, it must have been quite a leap to incorporate them into a European opera.
Oh, absolutely. Vogler wasn't just copying those melodies note for note. Imagine him more as a musical interpreter, filtering these melodies through his own understanding of musical theory and his vision of how to create that sense of Indianness for a European audience.
So he's building a bridge between these two musical worlds, trying to find a common ground where they could meet and mingle. Do we have any examples of what this musical fusion actually sounded like?
In Act 2, there's a really poignant aria where the character Naga sings a melody strikingly similar to a Malabar song transcribed by Bartolomeo. It's hauntingly beautiful, characterized by this technique that creates a kind of wavering effect between two notes. Vogler believed this technique, while used differently in Indian music, could really evoke a sense of emotional depth, maybe even turmoil, something he felt resonated with Indian music.
Interesting. So he's using a specific musical technique to try and capture the emotional essence of what he understood Indian music to be. And this wavering effect, it's used strategically, right? It's not just randomly throughout the piece.
Exactly. It's fascinating how Vogler uses this technique to mirror Naga's emotional state. Here she is, a character facing threats, caught in this difficult situation. And the wavering, almost melancholic melody reflects her inner turmoil.
It's amazing how music can convey emotions so powerfully, even without words. So we have the visually stunning wedding ceremony, this haunting melody, and Naga's aria. What other tools did Vogler have in his musical arsenal to transport the audience to India?
Vogler was really fascinated by the idea that each culture had its own unique musical identity. And he believed this identity could be brought to life through a combination of the core melody, like those he adapted, and what he called color it. Think of it as adding those musical colors and textures specific to a culture.
So he's like a musical chef, taking the core ingredients of Indian music, those melodies, and then adding his own European spices to create something new and exciting.
What a delicious analogy. And one of his main spices, so to speak, was his use of instruments, particularly woodwind instruments like flutes, oboes, and clarinets. He'd read descriptions of these instruments being prominently used in Indian musical ensembles, and he really believed their distinct sound would help paint that sonic picture of India for his audience.
So when the audience heard those woodwinds, it was like a signal, a way of saying, listen, we're now in the world of India. But Vogler didn't stop at just the types of instruments, did he?
You're reading my mind. Vogler was meticulous about incorporating those cultural nuances he'd read about. For instance, he was particularly intrigued by the way timpani, those large kettle drums, were used in India and Abyssinia. He had learned that the number of timpani used directly correlated with the rank of the person being honored.
So more drums equaled more importance. What a powerful way to use music to convey social hierarchy.
Exactly. And Vogler definitely utilizes this in Samori. The timpani really takes center stage in the overture, particularly in a section often referred to as Tambourin's Triumph. It's grand and majestic, instantly conveying Tambourin's status as the ruler of Madurai.
So it's not just about the sound itself, but the deeper cultural meaning Vogler attached to it. It's incredible how much thought and detail went into creating this sonic world of Samori. But with all this talk of authenticity and research, it makes you wonder, did they truly get it right? Could a European opera in the 1800s, even with the best intentions, truly capture the essence of another culture like India?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Remember, we're talking about a time when European views of the East were often shaped by colonialism and these romanticized, often inaccurate ideas about other cultures. Vogler and Huber might have been breaking free from some of the more blatant stereotypes, but their perspective was still inherently European.
Right, they were still looking at India through a lens that, while attempting to be clear, might have still colored their perceptions. Are there any examples of where this might be the case in Samori?
Well, for example, while Vogler was clearly fascinated by Indian music, his understanding was likely limited by the sources available to him at the time. Remember those transcriptions we talked about? They were helpful, but they were also filtered through a European lens using a musical notation system not exactly designed to capture the intricacies of Indian music.
So even those detailed accounts had their limitations. It's like trying to understand a whole new language, but only having a phrase book. You might pick up some words and phrases, but the true depth and nuance are lost in translation.
Exactly. And that's especially true when we're talking about something as vast and diverse as Indian music. Vogler was working with what was likely a very limited understanding of this incredibly rich and ancient musical tradition. It would be nearly impossible to grasp its complexities without actually experiencing it firsthand.
And that lack of firsthand experience might have led to some, let's say, creative interpretations along the way.
Precisely. Take, for instance, those wavering notes we talked about earlier, the ones Vogler used in Nagasaria. He seemed to associate them with negative emotions. And while that interpretation might hold true in certain contexts within Indian music, those same notes could have completely different meanings depending on the specific musical framework, the time of day, even the season they were being played.
Wow, so much cultural context we miss when we only have a fragmented understanding. It makes you realize how important it is to acknowledge that, even with the best research, sometimes our interpretations of other cultures are colored by our own limited perspectives.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember that Vogler and Huber weren't setting out to deliberately misrepresent Indian culture. Their goal seemed to be to learn, to showcase, and perhaps even to celebrate. But they were doing so within the confines of their time and with the knowledge that was available to them.
It's like they were trying to piece together this beautiful, intricate puzzle, but they only had a fraction of the pieces. Fascinating, but also a bit humbling, isn't it?
Absolutely. Samori offers us this fascinating glimpse into this period of cultural exploration, but it also serves as a reminder that even with the best intentions, truly understanding and representing another culture requires more than just research. It demands a deep respect, humility, and an awareness of our own limitations.
You know, Samori really gets you thinking about how music can transport us to other cultures. It makes you wonder, are there other examples out there, where composers have tried to capture that feeling of hearing something exotic in their music?
Oh, absolutely. It's
Yep.
a question that's fascinated composers for ages. How do you capture the essence of a culture through music? It's a delicate balance.
It's like you want to evoke a sense of place, but you don't want to fall into the trap of cliches or misappropriation, right?
Exactly. And throughout history, composers have tackled this challenge in really interesting ways with varying degrees of success.
Spill the tea. Give me some examples. Who should we be listening to?
Well, one piece that immediately comes to mind is Mozart's iconic Turkish March
Yeah,
from his Piano Sonata No. 11.
Oh, I love that one. It's so catchy.
It really is incredibly energetic. And he uses all these musical elements that were popular at the time, things that were associated with Turkish military music.
Like what?
Think the rhythmic power of percussion instruments, that distinctive minor scale, and those almost hypnotic repeated patterns.
Ah, so kind of like that Indian scale we were talking about in Samori, but with the Turkish twist this time.
You got it. And what's fascinating is that Mozart likely never even visited Turkey. Yet he managed to create a piece that, at least to Western ears, evokes this distinct sense of that culture.
It makes you wonder how much of that Turkish sound was based on actual Turkish music and how much was influenced by those romanticized perceptions of the Orient that were all the rage in Europe back then.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something we see time and time again with Western music that tries to portray other cultures. There's this element of exoticism, this fascination with the other, that's both alluring and often a bit romanticized.
Totally. So we've got Mozart dabbling in Turkish sounds. What else?
Let's fast forward a bit to Debussy's Pagodes from his piano suite Estampes. Debussy was utterly captivated by Asian music, especially the gamelan music of Indonesia.
The gamelan. Those instruments are incredible.
They're amazing, and Debussy thought so too. After hearing a gamelan orchestra perform in Paris, he was completely smitten. He tried to capture that sound in Pagodes.
Did he try to directly imitate those sounds, like use the same instruments and scales?
Not really. He wasn't going for a note-for-note recreation. But what he did capture was the soul of the music. Think those shimmering pentatonic scales, delicate layers of sound, and those subtle, mesmerizing rhythms. It's almost like he captured that ethereal quality of the gamelan.
It's like he's painting a sonic picture. Instead of focusing on the precise details, he's capturing the mood, the feeling, the overall impression of the music.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Pagodes so effective. It's not so much about Asian sounds, it's about being transported to another place through atmosphere and emotion.
It's amazing what music can do. So we've covered the classical and impressionist periods. What about more contemporary composers? Have they explored this cross-cultural thing too?
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole wave of contemporary composers pushing boundaries and exploring cultural representation in fascinating ways.
I'm here for it. Give me some names.
One that immediately comes to mind is Tan Dun. He's a Chinese-American composer, and his work is incredible. He blends traditional Chinese music with a more contemporary Western approach.
What does that sound like?
You'll hear instruments like the pipa, the erhu, the gong. He'll draw inspiration from Chinese opera and folk music, really giving you a taste of his cultural heritage.
So like Vogler, he's bridging different musical worlds, but from a more personal place, right?
Exactly, and it's incredibly moving and powerful. His music is this beautiful tapestry of East meets West, tradition meets innovation.
Okay, I'm adding him to my playlist. Anyone else I should check out?
Oh, definitely Osvaldo Golijov. He's an Argentine composer, and his music is like a giant fiesta of cultures. He blends Jewish and Latin American musical traditions together so seamlessly. You'll hear klezmer, tango, classical influences. It's exhilarating.
It's like he's created this whole musical melting pot, drawing flavors and spices from different cultures to create something completely new and exciting.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of contemporary music, isn't it? So many artists are pushing boundaries, blending influences, and reminding us of music's power to connect us across cultures.
Wow, we've really only scratched the surface here. It feels like the perfect place to wrap up our deep dive into Samori and this whole conversation about cultural representation in music. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. Samori, even though it was written centuries ago, brings up all these questions that are still relevant today.
Like, how do we approach cultural representation in a way that's both sensitive and authentic? And how do we appreciate the beauty of different cultures through art while recognizing that our interpretations might not always be perfect?
Exactly. It's complex.
Yeah.
But for me, the important thing is to stay curious, to be respectful, and to never stop questioning, learning, and engaging with all the amazing music traditions out there in the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Samori and beyond. Until next time, happy listening.